in a rare statement, Chief Justice John Roberts from the Supreme Court today issued a stunning rebuke of the president for challenging the integrity of a federal judge. Began yesterday when the president questioned the independence of the judiciary, saying that a ruling against his asylum policy in the Ninth Circuit was due to, quote, an Obama judge. Here's Trump.
Your asylum policy has been put on hold.
Well, you go to the Ninth Circuit, and it's a disgrace, and I'm going to put in a major complaint because you cannot win, if you're us, a case in the Ninth Circuit. This was an Obama judge, and I'll tell you what, it's not going to happen like this anymore.
Chief Justice John Roberts then took the unusual step of correcting the president, saying in a statement, we do not have Obama judges or Trump judges, Bush judges or Clinton judges. What we have is an extraordinary group of dedicated judges doing their level best to do equal right to those appearing before them. That independent judiciary is something we should all be thankful for. According to NBC News, quote, it's the first time the Republican-appointed leader of the federal judiciary has offered even a hint of criticism of Trump. Late today, the president responded to the Chief Justice saying, quote, sorry, Chief Justice John Roberts, but you do indeed have Obama judges, and they have a much different point of view than the people who are charged with the safety of our country, adding that, quote, we need protection and security. These rulings are making our country unsafe, very dangerous and unwise. Joining me now is Democratic Congressman Jim Himes, who sits on the House Intelligence Committee. Kim Whaley is a former federal prosecutor. Tim O'Brien is executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion. And Susan Del Percio is a Republican strategist. And Kim, let me just start with you sort of from a legal standpoint here. A couple of pieces here. The president yesterday going after the Ninth Circuit, and we've heard him do this before. The Chief Justice, though, then stepping in, as we just heard there from John Roberts, and the president choosing in public to go back at the Chief Justice. What do you make of that?
Well, it's astonishing, and I would say probably unprecedented for the Chief Justice to step out into the political spectrum in this way. But I think he said what needed to be said. And the framers of the Constitution understood that the judiciary is not supposed to be politicized. And I think what Trump is doing is trying to attack any critics, that is the federal courts that's holding him accountable, to capture the referees. And the way this is set up is these people have life tenure and they have salary protection for a reason. But we all, as Americans, also need to keep our eye on this issue because it really matters who's confirmed to the federal bench. That being said, and knowing Justice Kavanaugh, my guess is that neither Justice Gorsuch nor Justice Kavanaugh would agree with President Trump here, and they'd stand in line with Chief Justice Roberts, which is quite interesting because if this were ever to go to impeachment, this particular presidency, and if it were tried in the Senate, the Chief Justice would preside over that proceeding. And of course, we're teeing up it potentially in other areas with this presidency in an all-out constitutional battle about whether perhaps he could be subpoenaed by Robert Mueller, whether he could be indicted, and to poke at these human beings about their independence at this stage probably, I think, is going to motivate them to be as judicious as possible. And I say judicious, calling balls and strikes based on facts and law and not politics. So I'm 100% behind what Chief Justice Roberts did as a constitutional law professor, in addition to a former DOJ attorney. I'm happy to see it.
Yeah, and Congressman, to have the president, again, go back at the Chief Justice like this, be as blunt as Donald Trump is here. I mean, we're in uncharted territory. At the same time, I guess I'd ask a question to take a step back there. This idea that Trump is putting out there that, hey, yes, these aren't necessarily independent judges. They should be viewed as Democrat judges, in his word, Republican judges. Is there something to be said for the idea that our entire political system, the last, I'd say, 2 decades or so since that 5-4 Bush-Gore ruling in 2000, that there is a degree to which we've been treating it that way, that we have all these confirmation fights that are partisan, where the Democratic judge gets opposed by all the Republicans, the Republican by all the Democrats, the appointment from a Democratic president, Republican and president. We haven't always been talking about it that way, haven't we, collectively?
Well, you know, there have been certainly some high-profile confirmations where that has been the case, some high-profile decisions. But, you know, look, I agree. I think it was important for the Chief Justice to put the brakes on that notion. And the reality is that that's not actually the experience with the court. There have been decisions that conservatives disagreed with, certainly the upholding of the Affordable Care Act, which, of course, the Chief Justice was really critical to. Of course, the decision around marriage equality. So it's just too simple to say that, the courts are acting in a highly politicized manner. But you do make a good point, which is that more and more in an environment of polarization, those confirmation fights have been tougher. But look, you got to be precise about this. There was a difference between the Kavanaugh confirmation battle and the Gorsuch confirmation battle. But anyway, bottom line is I appreciate the Chief Justice really blowing the whistle and saying this is a moment where I'm going to stand up in an unprecedented way against a president who is trying to make the entire government look like they are either for Donald Trump or against Donald Trump. That's not the way the system works.
And do we know, Tim, he's been Trump, the president here, when it comes particularly to the Ninth Circuit, this has been a point of emphasis of his since the beginning of his presidency. I know some of his edicts have come into a conflict with the decisions of the Ninth Circuit, but this one particularly has bothered him from the beginning.
It has, because the Ninth Circuit is taking on his independence, is taking on his ability to do what he wants to do at the southern border and assess and determine the rules of engagement there. He's doing the same thing with Jim Mattis and the military presence on the border. And it goes beyond, in this case, both the military and the Ninth Circuit. I think it goes to Trump's own profound anti-institutionalism. He is doing this with a number of U.S. institutions. He did it with the Fed. He caused the Fed chairman, Jay Powell, to come out and proclaim that he's running an independent organization. He did it with the Supreme Court, prompting John Roberts to do it. He's doing it with Robert Mueller's investigation. He's done it with state and federal judiciaries. He does it with the media. The overall message here is very clear. He's profoundly authoritarian, and he doesn't believe in American institutions that have long standing, which, by the way, is a profoundly conservative issue and value, is this respect for institutions. The only force in American society right now that hasn't taken on Trump full bore is the GOP. They've acquiesced, and they're acquiescing around issues they should be embracing if they consider themselves to be good conservatives.
Susan, the Republican consultant, what do you say to that?
Well, I think it's important to also look at what's happened today and what we're now not talking about, and that President Donald Trump picked a fight with the Ninth Circuit because he was facing some really bad headlines today. There was a lot of talk about how he was handling Saudi Arabia after basically saying it's okay if you kill a Washington Post journalist, we'll still stand behind you. Another story came out that he was going after his political rivals. The talk of impeachment was up. We are still not sure what's going on, what the testimony was with McGahn. There's a lot of things coming out there. So what does Donald Trump do? He picks a fight with the Ninth Circuit, and he uses that as a way of deflection. And it's almost like he welcomed Justice Roberts coming out, because now he's having a whole nother conversation, and this is what we're talking about. Now, it was important, and I praise Justice Roberts. I also use it to say to the Republican leadership, that's what a leader looks like. This is what you're supposed to be doing. Republicans should be condemning this president on 3 fronts today. And it's no-brainer stuff. It's things they've believed in all of their lives. But, folks, look at what and how Justice handled himself. But more importantly, let's not forget the stories that came out today, because they are really disturbing.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.